Same old man.
Here's Johnny.
You're gonna need a bigger boat.
Why so serious?
Roll out.
I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the In Session Film Podcast.
Welcome to this podcast review for October 26, 2023. And I'm JD Duran. And for those watching on YouTube, you will see that I am once again co-hostless. Brendan is not able to be here because if you listen to the main show this last weekend, or for those that recently caught up with our review of Scorsese's Killers of the Flower Moon, Brendan is getting ready to go on his honeymoon. So he's going to be out. He's going to be MIA for a little while here. So I have scoured the internet once again for this conversation. I found a lovely guest that I'm very excited to bring back onto the show. Joining me once again is the great Megan Kearns. Megan, welcome back.
Thank you so much for having me back. It's such a privilege and an honor.
Absolutely. Really do appreciate it. It's always great to see you and to talk
Thank
to you.
you. Likewise.
It's funny. I'm going to bring the audience into this fun little irony. We were talking about it offline because this last weekend I was in Disney celebrating the birthdays of my wife and my oldest. And simultaneously, who else is at Disney World? Megan Kearns. Who would have guessed? What a wild coincidence. Should have just brought the podcasting equipment. We could have done it right there at the castle.
Doing it on the road.
Exactly. The road show with JD and Megan. All joking aside, though, that was a funny little coincidence. That's why we're doing this review now. We had originally hoped to do this last week, but we both had Disney plans, it turns out. So we are now recording this conversation a little bit late after Fair Play had released on Netflix, but I am very, very excited to get into this conversation. Before we get to it, though, Megan, I'm curious, did you have any sort of anticipation for this film? Was it on your radar at all, or is it just something that popped up and you gave it a spin?
So I didn't have anticipation initially, but I saw this back in January at Sundance. And and when I saw it, I was blown away. And it was a film I could not stop thinking about. And I've been thinking about it all year long. And so when it was about to come out in theaters and Netflix, I was anticipating it because I was very curious what other people were going to say. I was curious to rewatch it and revisit it to see if my feelings would be the same. And I think it is still very much a very striking, thought-provoking, intriguing film. So I did have a lot of anticipation to rewatch it.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. I honestly, and maybe I knew this, I don't know if I did. I don't know if I recall that this played at Sundance earlier in the year. I must have missed that. I do remember the trailer dropping a few months ago and caught a little bit of intrigue. Not just because of what this film is about, and there was certainly some curiosity there, but also Alden Ehrenreich, primarily because at the time the trailer dropped, we're right off the heels of Oppenheimer and people talking about his performance there. So this trailer comes out and it's like, okay, Ehrenreich is having himself a year. It seems. And, and I was very intrigued. And then, some time goes by. Once the trailer drops, I happen to just get on my Netflix and the preview content is there. I'm like, oh, the screener for this is available. It had kind of slipped my mind, so I gave it a spin. So I have seen this film. It has been a couple of weeks since I've seen it. I've been wanting to talk about it, but, as we noted, life gets in the way. But here we are. I am excited to get into this. It is written and directed by Chloe Domont. As I noted, it stars Alden Ehrenreich as well as Phoebe Dynevor. I'm not sure how you say her last name. as well as Eddie Marson, Rich Sommer, and a few others that come and go throughout the film. If you're not familiar with Fair Play, an unexpected promotion at a cutthroat hedge fund pushes a young couple's relationship to the brink, threatening to unravel far more than their recent engagement. All right, let's go ahead and jump further into this. You already teased us there with your thoughts on this, Megan, but what did you think about Fair Play?
Yeah, so I thought this was a really slick film, really well done as far as the visuals, the cinematography, sharp writing, like vicious dialogue that is just cutthroat and nasty and
Mm-hmm.
mean and just
Mm-hmm.
really ruthless in a way that I don't often see films. Like, it very much kind of harkened back for me to Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf with Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton, which
Mm-hmm.
is one of the best, for me, one of the best examples of kind of a relationship disintegrating and just vicious to each other.
Yeah.
I think the lead performances are outstanding. Like, I always have thought Alden Ehrenreich is he's fine. He's fine. He's there. I think
Okay.
I think he's exceptional here. Like, he is
Mm-hmm.
just on. I think this is another level of acting for him that I think is great. I
Okay.
really like Phoebe Dynevor. I also don't know how to pronounce her name, but she's great on Bridgerton. And so
Okay.
seeing her in this is, very different role, far cry from Bridgerton. And yeah, so I think it's really well directed, well written. The performances are great. And I think it's really fascinating depiction of power dynamics and gender roles and kind of
Mm-hmm.
the murkiness of them and how success and capitalism impact relationships. Like, it's just, there's a lot to unpack. And I just think it's a really fascinating film.
Yeah, I'm with you. I do really like this film quite a bit as well. And I'm coming at this from a couple of different angles. One, I do think simply from a film construction perspective, from a craft point of view, I do think it is really great. I'm with you. I think the writing here is sharp and biting. The direction of the film isn't overly complex, but it's diligent and it serves the writing and these characters, allowing both of those crafts to coalesce in these riveting ways as you're talking about. And I do think these performances are fantastic. Alden Ehrenreich, I actually really do quite love him as a
Oh, nice.
performer. Going back to Hail Caesar, where he gives such a comedically gripping performance in that film. And I noted earlier, people were talking about him in Oppenheimer, and I do think that in his limited screen time there, he's very effective.
Mm-hmm.
But you are right. What he's asked to do here is very different than something like that, very different than what we see in Hail Caesar as well. It's interesting to see him really cut his teeth in these riveting, dramatic ways as we see here. And I think he has really great chemistry with Devoner. I'm not
Yes.
familiar with her work. I've never seen Bridgerton, and I don't think she's done a whole lot in the filmscape quite yet. But I think she's fantastic here. And I do love their dynamic and how it taps into what you're talking about there in terms of the film's power plays and gender dynamics, gender roles, how all of that coalesces throughout the film. And there's a fascinating art to it, all right, because in those opening scenes, we do see a spark between them. It's tense, it's romantic, it's hot. And then as we get into the drama of the film and there's some tension at play in their relationship, as that synopsis alludes to, things begin to unravel in these really inviting and engaging ways that certainly leaves you jaw dropped in some places. I think the ending to
Oh,
this
yeah.
film is really quite great. I mean, the only thing that keeps me from fully embracing it, and I'd be curious if I were to rewatch the film, maybe there was something I missed on this first go around. I don't think, and maybe this is more so the marketing and what I expected walking in. To be fair, it might be more on me than the film itself, because I do think the trailer and some of the marketing of the film builds this up to be some sort of erotic thriller. And I don't think the film is that. At least for me, there's not as much sizzle in that regard. However, I do think there's a lot of sizzle simply in terms of its gender dynamics and workplace politics. That I think is fantastic. So I don't know if I came into the film with the right mindset, and that's more of a knock on the marketing than the film itself. So I'd have to revisit the film and really watch it exclusively through that lens, because I was waiting for some of that eroticism to bubble up to the surface. And outside of the beginning of the film, I don't think it's there, but I don't think that's a bad thing. And the other issue I'm still wrestling with, and I'm curious how you feel about this. I don't know how subtle this film is. I don't think it's very subtle at all.
No.
And that's not a bad thing, but I'm still wrestling with like maybe this is a film that doesn't need to be subtle given its thematic undercurrent. And I think that's an argument I'm willing to buy.
Yeah, that's, it's funny that I think it surprises me in certain ways that I do like this film so much, because I do, as much as I do love an out there bombastic film, I tend to gravitate towards the much more subtle films.
Same. Same.
Right. So, you don't need to knock everyone over the head with your themes and your message and your narrative and what have you. So, so I am kind of surprised that I did enjoy and find this film so fascinating, because it is very blunt and it is very obvious, and there is no subtlety at all. But I do think in a way that is the point. I think you're right on that, because I think since it is set in the world of finance and of investment, and all of that it is such a cutthroat industry that I feel like like Chloe Domont feels like, okay, we can't have a subtle film. It's got to be as, out there and aggressive as the people in this industry, or as the characters who are in this industry. But it's funny because I think of a film which is not dealing with these same things. It's dealing more with sexual harassment, but it is still dealing with some of the same themes. I think of Kitty Green's The Assistant, which is such...
I thought of that as well.
Yes, which is such a fantastic film, and is so subtle and is also very eerie, and is very much plays like a thriller too, because it's so tense in the way it's unfolding, but it is such a much more subtle film. So it is kind of interesting to think of that contrast, but I do think that the aggressive nature is a very intentional choice, but I can see it not fully landing with everyone because it is so overt and not and does not lack it lacks subtlety.
Absolutely. And I think because of how prevalent this is in our society, I feel like we see this in the news all the time, that to be a little bit more blunt and obvious with this is perhaps what's needed in order for the message to come through, even if it does maybe come off slightly, I don't know what the word is. I don't want to say, I don't want to say that it's, there's certainly credence to the film and what it's trying to say. And I think making the film as obvious as it is, especially now that we're talking about it out loud here, I do think is weirdly appropriate, because so much of this film boils down to those gender dynamics and workplace politics, as we noted, in this hedge fund corporate workplace that isn't just cutthroat. I do agree with you there, but it's also male dominated. Yes. And that's something the film speaks to in the beginning when they first show up at work. And even when the promotion is on the table and it's possible that Emily could be in the running for this, there's like snarks and jeers like, oh no, like he can't be a
Yes.
woman. God
Right,
forbid.
right.
You know? But as the film unfolds, and perhaps there's some spoilers to this, but I think for the sake of this conversation, we should reveal this. So if you want to go in completely blind, maybe come back after watching the film. But there's this tease early on that Luke, the Ehrenreich character, he might get the promotion. And, you know, this comes off the heels of Luke and Emily, who worked together at this hedge fund. They just got engaged. So it seems as if everything for Luke is going in the right direction. He's a young, handsome guy, going to get this awesome promotion, and just got engaged to this gorgeous girl who, you know, life couldn't be better, right? And then, of course, the film subverts that.
Oh boy, does it.
When Emily gets the job instead. And so over the course of the film, we see Luke struggling mightily with this news, and we see his ego deconstructed. So I think by being as obvious as it is, it's almost as if the film is saying the fragility of the male ego is so soft and tender that the only way for us to get this message through is to be as loud and bombastic as we possibly can, because subtlety in this instance, it's just not going to work. And look, I think there's credence to that idea.
Yeah, that's funny that you say that, because I had read that Chloe Domont said that one of the things that she was thinking about when making this film was about male fragility, and how do you reconcile that with women's empowerment, and why is a woman's success seen as such a threat? And that was kind of her jumping off point for the film. And then she was so angry because she had, in her own personal life, she had success and partners couldn't relate or were angry or were jealous, and she couldn't reconcile that. And so she started writing from a place of anger. But she realized that as she was writing this film and as she was crafting it, that she felt a lot of sympathy for Luke, which kind of surprised her, because because she was saying that men are also, you know, a victim of this system too, in the way this is constructed. And, you know, so there is a lot as far as, you know, male toxicity and toxic behavior, and but they're also their fragility and their ego. Like, there's just so much wrapped up in it. So it's so interesting that you mentioned that, because that very much was intentional on her mind, apparently.
That is exciting to hear. I guess then it's evident that her writing and direction and what she wanted the film to emulate, that comes through vividly, because that's exactly how I interpreted this film. And it is interesting to see Luke revel in that turmoil. And I do think that this is something that is equally as prevalent. I know I've seen this a lot in my life. This is also why I simply succumbed to it early on. I married a woman who makes twice the amount of money I do from the get-go. Like, there it is. It's like not even close who the breadwinner is in my house. And I think when you just learn to accept it, life is so much more peaceful. But for a lot of men, that certainly isn't acceptable. And look, to be fair to Luke, and maybe this circles back to that empathy that you're talking about, I don't think Luke is embodying a bravado or a male toxicity that is conventional, in the sense that when we first meet him, he seems genuine and affectionate. He clearly loves Emily in those opening scenes. It's like those things are brought out of him out of something utterly unexpected. He thought that he was going to have this promotion, something exciting was going to happen after a lot of hard work on his own terms, separated from Emily, because when they're in the workplace, they do try to have separate lives for reasons that become obvious. And after working as hard as you can at that job, of course you want the promotion. And when that not only slips through your fingers, broadly speaking, but for the person that you're engaged with, that you're sharing your life with, that will, of course, erupt some sort of emotion. And he simply did not know how to deal with it. What comes out of that is toxicity and fragility. And so I think it's interesting how Domont examines that out of something that was born out of something that really wasn't there on the surface initially. There's something that brought that out. And I do think that's in contradiction to a lot of the male coworkers they work with that are more overtly sexist, as we see with the Eddie Marson character, Campbell, for example, or any of the other managers there. They carry themselves with this arrogance that, of course, speaks to male ego, and they treat Emily as she's inferior. And so she has to, of course, carry a facade just so she can participate in the game,
Right.
which is a whole nother dynamic that we can talk about. But it is fascinating how she's able, speaking of Domont, to emulate that in her writing and direction here.
Yes. I agree with so much of what you said. The one thing, though, that I have to say, I personally don't have empathy for Luke. So I very much diverge from Chloe Domont, but it makes sense because she created this character.
For sure.
I would hope she would have,
it.
right, exactly. But I will say it's interesting because you're right. He is very different, like very different than the other managers who are telling these horrifically gross stories about like women having their bags over their heads, like and having sex during college. Like, oh my God.
Yeah, that whole story.
Like that story, that is repulsive. So he's not like that. However, I do think there's a little clue very early on that he's going to unravel, because when he thinks he's getting the promotion and after they've gotten engaged and he's in the shower with her, I think he's in the shower, but he says to her, he's like, when are we getting married? I need to piss on my tree and mark my territory, and you're my tree.
That's a great point.
Yeah. And I was like, and it's funny because it's one of those things, like, for as unsubtle as this film is, it's one of those things that you could very much interpret as like, oh, he's just joking around. He's just being silly. But when you look at it in context of everything else, it's like, ew, like that's kind of gross and very possessive and controlling. And so I'm like, ugh. And then especially later, what happens? Oh, so... His behavior. No. So there are, like, I think that is a very important clue for maybe he's not as great and nice as we think he is or as he seems, but he is, in comparison to the other men in the office, he is far and away a lot better.
Yeah. When the bar is on the floor,
you
don't have to do a whole lot.
No, that's the thing.
Yeah, that's exactly where the film lays the bar here.
Yes.
And in comparison, he's a knight in shining armor. But you do make a great point that line, as subtle as it is foreshadowing what is to come. I very much do agree. And while we speak to the film and its lack of subtlety, I will give the film credit for this as well, because there are moments here where Domont, as a writer and director, where she presents conflict, and while dramatically the film certainly gets into the depths of that conflict for sure, but there are moments here before we get to that tension where performance is allowed to relish in subtlety. For example, there's that moment when Luke initially finds out that he's not getting the promotion and that it's going to be Emily. And of course, she's expecting him to maybe be a little upset, but she also wants him to be happy for her.
Of course.
And there's a moment where Ehrenreich, with his performance, without saying anything, he has to evoke that conflict and what he's feeling internally. He is disappointed. He's upset. It's where that fragility first sprouts. But he can't say that. He has to tell her, of course I'm happy for you. And he starts telling her, that he loves her. He's going to support her, all the stuff that you would say to someone that you're engaged with. But we know that it's not entirely true. And that comes through very well in the performance, that duality. Again, maybe a little obvious, but I do like the attempts at letting the performance carry that duality. And and there are many more moments like that throughout the film for both Emily and for Luke. And then we get to the third act where that subtlety is pretty much all removed. And it's just these two barking at each other in these really engrossing ways. Dirty, for sure. The backstabbing is, I don't even know how you would describe it. It's
It's cutthroat.
It's cutthroat. Yeah, that's the word. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. It's funny. I've been thinking about something you said earlier where you said that the marketing maybe had set this up for you to be an erotic thriller. And I was thinking about that in relation to this because you're right. It is billed as an erotic thriller. And even though there are sex scenes in it and a lot of talk of sex, I also don't find this an erotic thriller. And I think that dovetails into that third act in that it is marketed as this, sexy, erotic. And I'm like, no, to me, there is nothing sexy or erotic about this film at all. Like, this is just like dirty. And I don't mean like fun, sexy, dirty. I mean, like, this is just nasty, low down, vicious, cutthroat fighting. And they just unload on each other. Like, almost, I don't even know if these are things that they've always felt or wanted to say, or just they're just draining everything out of them, out of, their frustration and their anger and fear and kind of all of it. But they're just going for broke where they don't care. Yeah. It's a scorched earth policy. And it is wild to watch.
And I do think the film builds to that well, where that middle section of the film, you do see Luke, while he is beginning to fall apart, he's still trying to keep it together in the workplace. He's trying to manage, these accounts where he can set himself up to be the next manager should a promotion come along. However, he's working under Emily, so of course there's some conflict there. And when one account goes really terribly, which makes them both look bad, the film at that point gives us some truth from the Marsden character of Campbell, where we come to realize that Luke isn't in a position for him to really ever succeed at this place. And from there, that's where the film's subtlety just completely dissipates. And I think the film builds to that well, methodically enough that when the third act comes, and you're right, it gets merciless. Like, it is relentless, the back and forth between the two, where Luke says some things to Emily that, to your point earlier, and why many might not have empathy for him, because he does and says some things that are unforgivable.
Oh my God.
It is incredibly aggressive, and these biting ways that where we see Emily recoil. She doesn't really even know how to react to it. And then there's a moment where he just completely disappears and she's left alone to fight off these wolves by herself. And where things escalate from there, it's engrossing. And like the final 15 minutes of this film it's incredibly engaging. It's wonderfully cinematic. The performances are exquisite, and it's melodrama at its finest. But those gender dynamics and the workplace politics of it all is still very much intact. So even as things are escalating and the relationship is completely deteriorating, and I do love the fun little irony that they were engaged at the beginning of all of this. So that is always lingering in the background, especially with Emily's mother, who we only meet in one brief little scene, but she's still steadily involved throughout the entire film.
Mm-hmm.
And so that irony, I think, adds some fascinating conflict and levity to all of it. But yeah, where it goes, it lacks subtlety, but it's dramatically riveting and thematically still potent, I think.
Absolutely. But I think it's also really exploring fascinating issues of consent and of assault and from both sides. And it's again like Luke to me is absolutely unforgivable. Period, full stop. Having said that, though, Emily also does make some choices that are not great and tries to coerce Luke in certain situations, which is kind of surprising to see. And I think speaks to how assured of a filmmaker Domont is here, where she very much knows the story she wants to tell. She very much is comfortable with her characters and is not afraid to have those levels of complexity within each of them.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. Shall we get to final thoughts? I
Yeah,
think we've
let's
covered
do it.
the film quite in depth here. Do you have any final thoughts on Fair Play?
I just think it's a really sharp film. As I've said, I think the writing is exceptional. I think the performances are excellent from both of them. They play off of each other so well. They feel like a real couple right from the start. You feel the spark, you feel their love for one another. And then to watch it disintegrate and unravel is just, it's an absolute tragedy, but it is a riveting one to watch. And I think this film raises a lot of questions and a lot of conversations about gender and gender roles and power dynamics and office place, what's acceptable, what's not. So I think this is a really, really great film.
I agree. I agree. I really like this film a lot. There's an interesting duality to it in that there's a riveting aspect to this film. It's very prosaic in a lot of ways as well. Emotionally, where this film goes in terms of the murky waters of male fragility, how all of that coalesces here, I think is really great. And it really it kind of comes down to, it wants to start a conversation about, as you noted earlier, female success. Why does that have to be a threat? Because it's not. It really isn't. Trust me, I'm speaking from experience. Not a threat at all to my existence. If anything, it is a benefit to my existence. And I check my ego at the door every single day, and I have a very comfortable life. But for a lot of people, that is a struggle. And I think that's a fascinating conversation to be had, that certainly a lot could be solved if male and female egos, specifically male egos, could, maybe be deconstructed in the way this film does, to highlight where those flaws could end up churning out something different, something better. Because a lot of this film comes down to Luke's choices, right? And what he feels early on, I think, is very human. His disappointment and not getting the promotion, there's nothing wrong with feeling that way. Emily, I think, expects it. She knows that when she walks into that room to give him the news, she is a little hesitant.
Right.
Because she's afraid that he's going to be embarrassed or disappointed. She's very aware of that, because that's the human reaction to have.
Right.
A lot of what follows simply comes down to Luke choosing that fragility. He could have instead, checked that at the door and have supported her the entire way, but that's not what happens. And look, that's a lot easier said than done, for sure. And that's, and this film, it's not a documentary. It wants to be this, this tense psychodrama. And I do think that the film is absolutely compelling in that regard. But in terms of it starting a conversation, I think it lays the foundation very well in that regard. And it's on Netflix, so this is very accessible. I imagine a lot of people are going to see this. And I'm curious what that conversation is going to be. I could see this, because I think back to 2014 when it comes to like a couple and power dynamic. David Fincher's Gone Girl. And how people talked about that film. As
I love that
film.
I love that film.
I do too. And, and of course, many people have joked about it over the years, like, oh, I'm getting married and, don't watch Gone Girl if you're getting married, that kind of thing. Fair Play is kind of the 2023 version of that. It's not quite as deadly, but a knife is involved.
A knife is involved. Yes. Yes. But it does raise the question of what, you're absolutely right on everything. Like, Luke it's a very human reaction, but why does he have to be so disappointed? Why can't he just support her success? And I think both Gone Girl and this definitely tap into female rage, which I am always here for.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting, Emily's reaction to it all, because she shows a level of graciousness that she did not have to. She could have been much more brazen about what Luke was doing.
Yes.
And no one would have blamed her.
Nope.
And while she gets a little bit of that in the final scene, and I love how the film ends, that final reaction from her and then cut to black is really fantastic. So she does get a little bit of satisfaction in that regard, but she shows him way more patience than was needed.
Oh my gosh.
And that's a fascinating contradiction to Luke in his calamity. So
calamity is a perfect description of what happens to Luke. He's a disaster.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's great. Yeah, obviously we're being a little vague with how it all unravels because you need to experience it. But yeah, it's great. Alden Ehrenreich, I think, is very, very good here in terms of emulating that abrasiveness, also that caring, that affection early on.
Yes.
And how that slowly devolves over the course of the film, I think is great. And Phoebe Dynevor is fantastic here as well. Mm-hmm. I love their dynamic. If anything, it's a compelling cinematic, riveting exercise to just go and experience, regardless of what you think about the film's subtlety or lack thereof. But yeah, I mean, I think its messaging is, sadly relevant today and probably will be for the next, God knows how long.
Until the dismantling of the patriarchy. You got it.
Exactly. Which, which might not ever happen unless Barbie enters the picture. We can only hope.
Let's
we can only hope
so.
Barbie and Ken show up.
Yay!
Megan, thanks for joining me. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you. I had a lot of fun too.
Tell me where we can find your podcast and your work on the internet. Where can we find you on social media?
Okay, you can follow me on social media. I'm at Opinioness World on Twitter and Blue Sky, and I'm at The Opinioness on Instagram and Letterboxd. You can find me at Spoiler Piece Theater. I co-host that podcast. We have new episodes every Friday, spoilerpiece.com. And you can also find me co-hosting the limited series podcast, The Slashers Podcast, where you can find us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify.
Yeah, please go and check out her wonderful, wonderful work. Give her a follow on social media. I really appreciate you being here, Megan. This was really great.
Thanks so much, JD.
You can follow us on social media as well. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Blue Sky. Just search In Session Film. If you're watching us on YouTube, of course, be sure to Subscribe, like the video, all that fun jazz. You can subscribe on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Leave us reviews on those platforms. If you could, we would greatly appreciate it. Let us know if you agree or disagree with anything we had to say here. We would love to hear your thoughts. You can always email us insessionfilm@gmail.com if you want to hit us up in long form as well. With that, do you have any final thoughts, Megan, on anything before we leave?
Oh, geez. Watch lots of movies?
Yeah, watch lots of movies. You have a really wonderful piece on Killers of the Flower Moon.
Oh, thank you so much.
I would definitely urge people to go and check that out. It's on her Twitter. If you want to go and check it out, that's where I saw it.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's very good. Definitely go and give that a go. Yeah, I mean, that's a really great movie. That's 3.5 hours. And
it's worth it, though.
Worth your time.
Yeah.
Go check it out. Check that out and Fair Play. Come back to us. Really appreciate you being here, Megan. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching, everybody. We'll see you next time on the In Session Film Podcast.